All right, so one thing he doesn't do that one could kind of almost think he does is blame these people like Reagan and Thatcher for creating the problem. What he is saying is that the conditions were such that people like these emerged in a way that was heard because the neoliberal thinkers that Reagan and Thatcher were listening to were talking about something that had come to the fore, namely the pressure for globalization, corporate expansion, overseas markets, the offshoring of production. These trends were ongoing. And I think that this theory provided good explanation and a sort of rosy scenario in which all of this would somehow make people better off. It sounded good. I will say, having lived through it, it sounded good. At first I didn't buy it, and then at a certain point I did for a while, and then I realized that it actually didn't pay off and I stopped buying it. But he says a little bit further down on that same page 6, he says, they argued that unless European countries in particular rolled back the securities that have been built up since the Second World War for the industrial working class and the bureaucratic public sector, and unless the trade unions were tamed, deindustrialization, which was a new concept at the time, would accelerate, unemployment would rise, economic growth would slow down, investment would flow out, and poverty would escalate. So deindustrialization was already occurring as industrialization was moving overseas. And these folks were giving a theoretical construction to this that was partly fear-based and maybe largely fear-based. If we do not make things easier for business to stay here, if we don't take away laws and regulations that hinder them in some way, support for labor unions, and so on. If we don't lower their taxes in particular, then they'll just go overseas. Well, they were going to go overseas anyway, no matter how much of this was done. And indeed, we now see that's true without a shadow of a doubt. So it wasn't, I guess, I don't want anybody to make the mistake of thinking that it was because of Reagan or Thatcher that these things happened. But what they spoke of accelerated and legitimized a process and institutionalized it in a way that became attractive to both major political parties in the United States. And really still is the mainstream ideology of both political parties. So Standing says one neoliberal claim that crystallized in the 1980s was that countries needed to pursue labor market flexibility. Well, this theme of flexibility is a really big one in this chapter defining the precariat. Wage flexibility, employment flexibility, job flexibility, and skill flexibility. And he goes into each one of them. The overall point is that a lot of workers are being asked to be infinitely flexible, a sort of just-in-time type of system for human capital and not just inventory, okay? So that corporations could get just as much labor as they needed and no more to be able to keep their costs as low as possible. And the problem, of course, is that human beings are not like capital, not like any other resource, even though we name them human capital and human resources. They are human beings. And so a huge problem develops when you treat people as though they can be this infinitely flexible. Now, a little bit of context here. He very briefly goes through all the classes in society that he sees at this point. So this is not a bourgeoisie versus proletarian situation anymore. From his perspective, the classes are more varied and complex than that. But he speaks of these 6 here. The elite are the corporate CEOs who are, millionaires, multimillionaires. Then there's the salariat. Those are the people like myself, okay? People who make a salary in the corporate world as well as in the government world, and can count on it throughout their career. And that's a very stable and enviable source of employment. So the professions are a mysterious class to me, because I think that, properly speaking, many of them might fall into the precariat, even though they make really good money. He says they live with the expectation and desire to move around without an impulse for long-term, full-time employment in a single enterprise. The standard employment relationship is not for them. Who knows, what people would really prefer, or whether they're talking themselves into it because the money is so good. These are people I used to be related to, at least one, who will move anywhere, and will be like moving for, higher pay, different and more challenging position, with no expectation that they're going to be wherever they're at like 2 or 3 years later, or that they'll be doing the same thing. They might be doing a very different project, but based upon their skills and experience, they can do it. And they amass enough wealth, at least they could, if they were saving it, to be able to, have a good retirement, if the stock market doesn't plunge, that is. Anyway, I don't know. I would say many of them are realistically in the precariat, even if they don't think so. And then you have manual workers, or the old-fashioned working class. And these are the few people, the ever-dwindling number of people who are still employed in the United States, for instance, or in in Europe as factory workers, as industrial workers, with some job guarantees, with union protection and things like this. And then we have the precariat. And of course, he's going to spend most of his time in this chapter describing that class. And then under them is a class of social detritus, basically, the unemployed, the detached, even the homeless, people living without anything like an adequate income. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about the precariat and what it's characterized by. All right, so he says they have minimal trust relationships with the state, unlike the salariat. Somebody like myself, I've been working for the state for most of my life. I do have a minimal trust relationship with the state. I wouldn't call it maximal. But I think a lot of people in my position do. In other words, their experience of it is that it is a kind of provider, and it provides not only income, but job security and stability. He says the precariat have few social contract relationships. So they unlike the working class, who has the union and the government regulations that may deal with their workplace environment and things like that, the precariat don't have those either. They have no unified identity. That goes along with that observation. They are often in temporary and part-time jobs. In fact, in the United States, I think you can work, is it 30 or 32 hours? Somebody will say so, say what it is. But you have to work under 40 hours a week. And if you do, then you don't have to be provided any kind of benefits whatsoever, health insurance or others. So employers have a strong incentive to keep you in that part-time role. Oftentimes, precariat workers are actually independent contractors these days, legally not even working for the company that they're actually working for. Also, sometimes they're interns working for nothing at all. Often, they are working well below their educational attainment, and the skills that they have are not being used, or not all of them are being used. They experience job insecurity, and he defines this as a constant moving around, whether that's in the same corporation, where you move from one type of job to another whenever the employer wants you to, and or being asked to move physically from one place to another. Okay? Neither one of those is good, and it's another level of this flexibility that's required from people. And I will say, I do have some experience observing people who have to deal with job insecurity, as in the constant churning of job titles, job responsibilities, and occupants of jobs. And I can tell you that it lends itself to the utter decrepitude of an institution. And I think we're beginning to see this falling apart, this sort of moldering, rotting, falling apart of corporate and government institutions due to this strategy of demanding job flexibility and, maximizing labor by, making sure that workers can be moved around and changed and juggled, however appears to be efficient at the moment. What you get is an incredible amount of demoralization. You get an incredible loss of institutional knowledge. You get more mistakes. You get a defeated and unenthusiastic workforce. You get, maybe above all, just immense confusion. For the person, he says, the person who's caught in this web of constant churning, you have a lack of identity. There is no ability to draw identity from one's occupation if one's occupation is temporary, part-time, contractual, and insecure, and constantly shifting, churning, and changing. And so such a person is going to become anxious, is going to become dispirited. Okay, he says, policies promoting labor flexibility erode processes of a relational and peer group interaction that are vital for reproducing skills and constructive attitudes to work. If you expect to change what you are doing at almost any time, to change employer at a short notice, to change colleagues, and above all, to change what you call yourself, work ethics become constantly contestable and opportunistic. So you don't feel any stake in that place that you're working, in the organization you're with. You don't identify with it. And that means that you see it more as a temporary vehicle that keeps you afloat. All right, so there's no trade-off of your self-interest there, since your employer is treating you as though there's no trade-off of his self-interest either, right? He's not caring about you, so you don't care about him, so to speak. I'm personifying, but I think you get the point. So Standing talks about these 4 A's that develop amongst the precariat because of the type of employment that they experience. Anger, which he says stems from frustration at the seemingly blocked avenues for advancing a meaningful life and from a sense of relative deprivation. Anomie, a feeling of passivity born of despair, compounded by the condemnation lobbed at many in the precariat by politicians and middle-class commentators, castigating them as lazy, directionless, undeserving, socially irresponsible, or worse. That is, blaming them for where they're at. Anxiety, from chronic insecurity associated not only with teetering on the edge, but with a fear of losing what they possess. And alienation, from knowing that what one is doing is not for one's own purpose or for what one could respect or appreciate, it is simply done for others at their behest, which is the humiliation factor in this type of employment, that it really is employment for others at their behest and doesn't have a redeeming quality in and of itself in the work that's being done. So he says the mix of rising anger, anomie, anxiety, and alienation comprises the inevitable flip side of a society that has made flexibility and insecurity cornerstones of the economic system. If you work in this type of environment, which is just one, but this is kind of like the call center or foundation environment, I would say, then you probably have a mix of anger, anomie, anxiety, and alienation. And What happens to that? Well, I mean, Standing ends on this very question. What happens to that? What does that turn into? He makes a very good point here. He says, human society has not been built over the centuries on permanent, incessant change. It has been based on the slow construction of stable identities and rather rigid spheres of security. A lesson of the Enlightenment is that the human being should be in control of his or her destiny and not God or natural forces. But the Precariat is told that it must answer to market forces and be infinitely adaptable. So you see what he's done there? He said the Enlightenment story is that you are independent. But at this point in time, the Precariat is told that it has to answer to market forces and be infinitely adaptable. That is to go back in a way to the idea that some higher power is telling you what to do. But unlike the feudal period, where the peasant, who by the way may have had some sort of subsistence guarantee or a source of subsistence that could offset some of the poverty that he experienced, the peasant believed that his place in the world and the fact that he had to answer to authority was a part of God's will. So maybe it was a little easier to take than it is for the precariat worker, for whom the only reason why he or she has to answer to the authority at any given moment is because if they don't, they may be living in their car. Well, what ultimately happens is people get angry enough to become alienated, and that alienation can be turned in unhealthy directions and in directions that don't point to the ultimate cause, but are nevertheless, under the circumstances that he has painted, somewhat understandable. He says a temporary low-wage worker may be induced to see the welfare scrounger as obtaining more, unfairly, and at his or her expense. A long-term resident of a low-income urban area will be easily led to see incoming migrants as taking better jobs and leaping to the head of the queue for benefits. Tension within the precariat are setting people against each other. Many will be attracted by populist politicians and neo-fascist messages. And as a reminder, this was first published in 2011. So Standing seemed to understand where we were headed. Next week, I will at least cover why the precariat is growing.